You will recall at the end of our last class, we were talking about what are really alternative modes of intervention. And we actually got to prevention. And I was, making the point that, prevention falls into three categories. There was primary prevention, secondary prevention, tertiary prevention. And the term prevention can kind of throw you off. If you recall, secondary prevention really referred to groups of people who had a problem, and you were trying to intervene early in the problem so that they would not get worse. So these are the people, for instance, when you have treatments like at community mental health center outpatient clinics, therapists' private offices, student counseling centers. You tend to think of that intervention as secondary prevention. Now then, in tertiary prevention, we use that term when we have someone who is already quite troubled. That is, we tend to think of that as focusing around people who have been psychiatrically hospitalized, maybe psychiatrically hospitalized more than once, people who have a psychotic disorder, schizophrenia, manic depressive illness, etc. And the tertiary prevention is, first of all, to treat the person in their current state so that they don't get worse. And then secondly, hopefully you're going to keep them in some kind of treatment that will prevent them from having another episode of this very devastating disorder. Now with primary prevention, if you remember, I was pointing out primary prevention really is an attempt to kind of assess the community, see what dangers lie in the community, and to see if you can introduce programs that will actually keep people from ever having the problem. And in some cases, in fact, just at the end of our last class, I was saying there are some problems where prevention is the only thing that will work. And I was using the example of the HIV virus. When we discovered this thing called the HIV virus, medicine and our society were really unprepared to deal with it. That is, we didn't have a way to, if someone had the HIV virus, to cure it. So the early focus became prevention. And prevention took a number of roads. The first one was, of course, you want to educate the community. That is, you want to alert a large population of people. In the beginning, we were especially trying to alert the gay population. But then we also wanted to, we found we better alert the drug-abusing population, that is, people who use needles. And so programs were developed to tell people, if you're going to be sexual, especially, in fact, with anybody who you are not really familiar with. In other words, if there's any risk of transmission, you want sex to be protected. So there was, a lot of attention to teaching people, trying to encourage people to use condoms and realizing that the risks were if they did not do that, or to abstain. Then we began realizing that people were transmitting the HIV virus by sharing needles. So if you had a drug addict who was HIV positive, they used a needle, that didn't clean it, handed it to someone else, that the blood transfusion, that is blood from the infected person to the uninfected person, infects the second person. And of course, it was around that time that we began discovering that the blood supply in the country, that we had not been testing for the HIV virus. So a number of people became infected, both children and adults, who were hemophiliacs. That is, people who had blood transfusions. Famous one is Arthur Ashe, if you recall, became HIV positive as a result of surgery. So when we realized that, we understood we have to find ways to prevent. And one way, of course, is screening the blood supply, so you make the blood supply, good. but others was you really had to get to people's behavior. And primary prevention, which in many ways is a public health term. I mean, public health has done the most with this. But they started with the idea that we simply have to educate the population. I believe I may have mentioned here earlier, at times we even developed programs for children. We started educating children in grade 1. In fact, actually in kindergarten, all the way through grade 12. And they had these steps about just what should you tell a child about the HIV virus that they could understand, but that would keep them from, doing something that could harm them. So, like if they see blood, don't put your hand in blood, and various kinds of things like this. As they grew older, they could take in more knowledge, and you could be helpful to them. And I think yesterday I also used the example that we began educating mothers, there's new mothers after we understood this, that actually you could transmit the HIV virus through the mother's milk. That was a little later discovery. So, and obviously the discovery came because we found these infants who were HIV positive, and they had not seemed to be HIV positive at birth. Like mom was HIV positive, but the child wasn't, and then the child became HIV positive, and we began realizing it's after birth that mom actually was communicating or transmitting the virus, and so we began educating mothers who were HIV and positive, and they were about to deliver, that they should not breastfeed their child. Now, the problem, of course, since then has become worldwide, and here's where you begin to see where primary prevention in some situations works and in some it doesn't. In some cultures, our own culture actually, we have done a fair job in the United States of being able to educate people and therefore reduce the incidence of people being infected with the virus. On the other hand, there are countries where it's very difficult to get men to use condoms. That just is not part of their culture. They don't want to do that. And so we've had tremendous spread of the virus in those countries. And we are still in the process then of learning, even when we know there is a serious health problem and we know how to prevent it, we are still struggling with trying to understand what kind of motivations do you have to develop, and how can you educate people in such a way that they'll actually receive the education. So you can see that primary prevention, it becomes a tremendously important area. Now, occasionally, you actually have, positive effects that come from primary prevention that really weren't intended. One is, with Head Start. If you recall when Head Start, which was for preschoolers, and the idea was that they would develop healthy working relationships, and you would really encourage these working relationships between parents and their children and the schools. You want to get everybody involved. And the program, Head Start really did have some success. But what surprised people was they also found out that Head Start children actually showed a significant decrease in antisocial behavior, and it lasted in the long run. That is, if you compared children who were exposed to Head Start to those who weren't, and you looked at children who seemed to have antisocial behavior very early in their lives, those who participated in Head Start seemed to get over it. And those who didn't, of course, later on, showed symptoms. Now, the other alternative area that your book talks about is community psychology. And community psychology, took a lot of its thrust from what was observed in trying to work in the area of primary prevention, kind of sees itself as certainly focused on primary prevention and secondary prevention. I mean, those are the areas of it. But it developed in many ways because psychologists became very frustrated, with the fact that we weren't making the inroads that we really should be making. That is, we really weren't keeping people out of the hospital the way we felt we should. We really weren't creating the culture in the schools that we thought we should. And there was a feeling psychology had a lot to offer to culture. That is, if we could get more active in the community and people became more psychologically sensitive, they would behave differently and we would have less problems. And this, by the way, started during the 1950s, big in the 1960s. And it also was tied to other kinds of research, like at that time we were realizing that psychiatric diagnoses are not very reliable, something we've discussed in here several times. And also this was the period in which research was beginning in psychotherapy, and there was real pessimism as to really how effective is psychotherapy. Then there were other studies that showed even if mental health interventions work, just the incidence of people who seem to have mental disorders was far outstripping the number of people that we were preparing who could treat the people. So even if we could do something, we wouldn't have enough people to do it. And so psychologists began, kind of identifying, some psychologists began identifying with public health and saying, actually, it would be much better if we found ways to prevent things. Now, the field, unfortunately, in psychology, had some trouble defining itself. And it was made more difficult by the fact that, especially in academic psychology, where people very much need to get grants, the national institutes were not terribly interested in funding a lot of these things. And in fact, the Journal of Community Psychology, which is an American Psychological Association journal and one of the ones that is fairly well read, it didn't start till 1973. And while in your lives that may seem quite a while ago, in psychology that's a very new journal. Most of the journals have much longer history than that. And actually, I was an author of the first two articles that appeared in the very first edition of the Journal of Community Psychology. And the reason was we had done a study that the editor of the journal thought was the kind of study that he was hoping other people would submit. And what we had done is, myself and a group of colleagues decided that we would train community leaders. And we felt that if we're going to get psychology into the community, maybe you got to start with somebody who's going to have influence over a lot of other people. And we happened to choose, as our first target group, we chose clergy. And we chose them because we noticed that clergy relate to large groups of people. And they're constantly working with groups. So our hypothesis was we could make them more effective if we would teach them how to be excellent group leaders. So we put together a training program for a large number of clergy, and we taught them group dynamic skills. That is, we taught them, when you're in a group, what are the kinds of things that are effective for a leader to do? How do you involve people in the group? How do you perceive problem members in the group? How do you deal with problem members in a group? How do you make sure that you keep your group moving forward? How do you determine an agenda that will be meaningful to people? How do you get people excited about it, etc.? And so we ended up with a fairly large number of people. In fact, this was well received. Lots of people wanted the training. So in our first attempt, we took half the people and we randomly assigned them to our training program. And the other half, we told them that we would assign them to round 2. So in round 1, we had a group of people who were getting the training, and then we had a group of people who were on so-called waiting list, thus being our control group. So we took people through several weeks of training, and then we decided to have them lead groups. And we also took the control group, because these were people who dealt with groups all the time, and we had them lead groups. So we had target areas of what the people were to get accomplished in their groups. And then we took social psychologists who did not know anything about our study and had no idea whether or not the group leaders were the people we trained, or they were the people who were on the waiting list. They didn't even know there was such a thing. And so we had them come, and they attended the various groups, and they rated the leaders to see how effective the leaders were. And the outcome of the study was that these independent raters, who were, and these were all people skilled in group dynamics, rated the leaders we had trained to be significantly better group leaders on all kinds of variables than those people who hadn't had the training. Now, that's very meaningful, because you have to realize we didn't start with a group of people who didn't know anything about working with groups. I mean, clergy work with groups all the time, so you assume they have developed a certain level of skill. Yet we were able to show, even for people with a certain level of skill, you can raise that significantly higher. You can make people much better in working with these groups, and you can help them to tune in to the dynamics of a group, to the needs of a group, and you can teach them skills about how to deal with problems in the group that make them much more effective. And that's an example of the kinds of intervention that community psychology was trying to develop. In other words, let's get out there. Let's not just say we're only going to train PhD students to do psychotherapy in state hospitals or mental health centers. Why don't we get out there with these people who already have contact with lots of people, and see if we can help them to be more effective in their work. And part of the skills that we taught these individuals were how you would recognize someone who was showing a number of symptoms. I mean, often people don't get help in mental health systems until they do something outrageous, or they develop symptoms that are so serious nobody can miss it, so they get brought in. Part of our goal was not only to teach people how to be effective in groups, but if you could pick somebody out in a group who really needed help, how you refer that person, so that people would get help earlier in their life, require less intense intervention, and probably do better. Now, community psychology branched out, and it really did apply the kind of principles I'm talking about to a number of areas. For example, they were the ones who came out and developed this idea of safe zones in neighborhoods, with the idea that it's very difficult to simply, you can't march into Houston and simply say, we're going to make Houston drug-free. If that's your goal, probably you're not going to get very far. Probably you're grandiose and you don't have much insight. But, to get a group of motivated citizens on a block that decide to protect their children and to say, we're not going to allow any drugs on this block, and to really get the word out to people who are pushers, for example. We see you on our block, we're calling the police. We're going to make sure our kids don't interact with you. You teach the kids, etc. All the kinds of things that went on in creating safe zones actually were quite effective. That is, there were places where children then realized, if I'm on my block, I will be safe. And if you remember, then they started safe schools, where the school began to develop the culture that they just won't tolerate drugs. And when you kind of target a small enough community, and you really have motivation, that is, the people there want to do it, and you teach them the skills about how you work in this kind of world, you can be very effective. Then now what happened with this, though, is that the challenges that community psychology faced were really more than most people thought. The theory was great. Let's get out there and prevent all kinds of problems. We've got all this psychological knowledge. Most people don't know about our psychological knowledge. Let's teach people about psychology. But, we learned, for instance, that just going into certain communities, like where we would have an obvious drug problem, and you would try to get the community to understand, we need to do something. Well, sometimes communities rebelled over the idea that if you identify us as having a significant drug problem, people will think everybody here has a drug problem. My kids don't fool around with drugs. I've told my kid this is not going to happen. I don't want my kid having the label of perhaps being in danger of using drugs. So you ran into resistance from people who felt that the very fact that you would come in with an intervention program might be labeling their community, and they just did not want that. And then, there's these wonderful human problems that develop. I was working in a community mental health center one time, and we decided we were going to work in this community that did have a very significant drug problem. And we had an association that very much, that is a community association, that very much wanted to change this. And so we began working with this community association, and the people who worked for the association lived in the community. They were very bright, very motivated. And we got a guy who was kind of undergoing a conversion. He had been a big drug pusher. And he had decided, he'd gotten over his own drug problem, and he had decided he really would like to intervene. And of course, he became terribly important. He knew who was pushing drugs. He knew where the centers were. He knew all about this kind of culture. And as things progressed, I learned that he was working for, he was hired by this community organization, and he was having an affair with the director. And so they were together all the time. They were real motivated to do this. Well, then the guy goes off and he has an affair with somebody else. And this woman, who is the director, gets very angry. So she sends him to an outpost way out in the sticks. I mean, as far out in this county as you could go. So now our guy, who is the key for us in this, drug prevention program, is no longer available to us. He's not allowed to come into the main branch. He's not allowed to be in this community, etc. And so we lose him, and of course the program collapses. And psychologists, if you're in academia where you're well protected and everything, you can lose track of the real world. And in the real world, things like this really happen. And so our great program fell apart. And there are lots of psychologists, by the way, who can tell you similar stories about where you start something, theoretically, what does this make sense? But when you're trying to intervene in a large population, a population you don't have control of, and a population with lots of divergent thinking and with lots of different motivations, these programs become very, very difficult. What I would tell you, though, is that community psychology still continues, and it's a small part of the big world of doctoral level psychology, partially because it doesn't have the rewards for many people who enter it that, say, being a psychotherapist has. I mean, one of the wonderful things in clinical psychology is if you're doing psychotherapy, when someone comes into your office and they're terribly depressed, and they're even thinking of ending their life, and you work with them, and they overcome this depression, and they begin to function very well, and they start making real important decisions, and you can just see their life improve. That's tremendously gratifying. And as a psychotherapist, you see this happening all the time. You always have some people who are really showing very significant improvements. When you work in community psychology, the improvements are hard to see, because they're so global. And often what you're feeling is the frustration that things are going so slowly. I mean, if you want to change a community, you better be very dedicated, you better be very patient, you better have picked a very good target problem, and it has to be that the community thinks that the target problem you've picked is one that they would pick. And then you need a high degree of cooperation. And nothing is ever as smooth as like somebody who's been very depressed and they cease being depressed and they're very productive. I mean, a nice clean picture of wonderful growth. In the community, it's always mixed. So finding, young people who see that as the work they want to do is not easy. So in community psychology programs don't nearly have the applicants that other programs in psychology have. Now, Also, in this world we've been talking about alternative interventions, there are self-help groups. And I wanted to just return to examine some of the power that exists in group interventions. Now, we've mentioned this before, and you probably all have some familiarity with Alcoholics Anonymous. I mean, very famous self-help group. And there really are a number of important features in it that are worth studying. One is, and this is really powerful, if you're alcoholic and you join AA, and you can join AA just by going to a meeting, but you are given a person who is called your sponsor. Now this person is another alcoholic, but who has been dry and who is highly motivated to help other people to remain dry, that is, to not be indulging in drinking alcohol. Now, the thing with the sponsor is, the sponsor makes the commitment that I will be available to you 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Extraordinary commitment. That means, you know, if you feel that you need to talk to somebody because you're about to go back to drinking, you can call this person and talk to the person. Frequently the person will come over and visit with you. In fact, many people who are sponsors go to extraordinary lengths, give of themselves really unbelievably in order to help keep somebody else from returning to drinking. Then AA has a 12-step program, and you may be familiar with that. And the 12 steps are, as you would imagine, I mean, they're successive steps. You have to kind of do step one and have some success there to move to step two. But the nice thing about it is there's a path. Like AA is saying to you, you want to achieve sobriety, you have to get into our 12-step program and you have to start working on these. And the steps are pretty concrete, so you know what you have to do. The only one that became somewhat controversial was that at one time you had to acknowledge a God. And people began challenging that AA was becoming a religion. So it shifted, and they said, you know, you really do need to acknowledge some kind of higher power. And they made it so vague that whatever higher power meant was whatever it meant to you. So you really didn't have to accept the idea that there was a God. And AA did not want itself to be seen as a religion. Now, on top of that, if you live in any kind of large city, every day of the week, 7 days a week, there are AA meetings. In fact, in a city like this, there would be many AA meetings. You could probably go to an AA meeting every hour of the day. Now, the plus with that is, if you get an uncontrollable urge, or you feel it's getting to be uncontrollable, that you want to go out and start drinking again, and now you've been dry for a while, you can go to an AA meeting. And anybody here ever been to an AA meeting? Seen movies of it? Are you familiar with? You have, okay. What do you recall from it?
There's a lot of like sharing and like a lot about like trigger experiences, like what you're pushing the button.
Yes, please.
There's just a lot about like I don't know, like people talking about their own personal experiences, things they've done when they were messed up. Like a lot of talking about craving and what triggers the problem behavior.
Okay, yeah, that's very good. So what happens at the AA meetings is that people tell their stories. They talk about their struggles. And in many cases, you know, just very real people, sometimes very eloquently, will tell you stories about how low they became. That is, the behaviors they engaged in, the utter poverty of spirit and maybe poverty of income that happened to them or that they created for themselves. And if you're there are a couple of things you can do. One is you can get up and tell people that, you know, you are about to fall apart, and people become very supportive. Or you can just go there and listen. Sometimes the actual inspiration of being around people and realizing, you know, I mean, I want to go drink because I didn't get a raise. This guy, lost his job, his wife, his children, and all these other things. And suddenly, one may feel a little less pressure, excuse me, because one has heard someone else who has shown that, life can be much worse than it is for me. And also, you can talk with people before and after. Now, AA also has the pluses. There are no dues. Everything about AA is free. Also, it is anonymous. They don't have a membership list. That's one reason why, there's really not much research on AA, is because they really do guarantee anonymity. That's been a premise of AA for a long time. And on top of that, if you are a member, by definition, you are alcoholic. So there's a sense that everybody in the organization is equal. We are all alcoholics. So if one of us, well-intentioned, we wanted to go and join AA, we could not do that, because you have to be alcoholic to join AA. And that's an important feature when you realize that all the people around me, all the people are going to stand up and give talks, and the people who are here in the audience are struggling with alcoholism. Now, I'm not aware of currently exactly how it's doing, but when I knew a lot about it, they used to have two kinds of groups. They used to have open meetings, which meant people like myself could just walk in. So I walked in and sat down and listened to meetings, and that's where I really began to see the power of this thing. Then there are closed meetings where none of us would be admitted, because if you're going to be admitted, you have to be acknowledging the fact that you have a serious problem with alcoholism. But the groups don't want people coming in, for example. They don't want a reporter coming in and identifying people. They try to protect the anonymity of people, but at the same time, they really are open to allowing, they would allow us to come in to many of their meetings and listen, hoping that we would develop a sensitivity for what people with alcoholism struggle with. And this has been a very, very successful, intervention. Now, I mentioned too that, the one concern people had was that maybe this is a religion, and they overcame that with making their language more vague. But they did create this sense that you should have some sense of spirituality. Now, what that did, and this is where you get outcomes like you might not have expected, but churches became very positive about AA. And so many churches have donated rooms and allow people to meet there. After all, this is an organization that has no money, so they can't go out and rent rooms. They got to get their rooms free. Well, many of the rooms they get free are in churches, because churches feel that they have kind of the spirit that we have, and so we're going to let them use these rooms. AA existed for a long time as kind of the only group of this type. But then others began seeing that, self-help groups really do work. Self-help groups help a lot of people. So then you got the development of Narcotics Anonymous, Gamblers Anonymous. In other words, you got groups focused on other problems besides alcohol, but they develop the same spirit. That is, we're all in this. We'll talk to each other and talk about our struggles. Maybe the insights that I can provide about how my alcohol problem or my drug problem or my gambling problem developed, and mistakes that I made and the struggles I had and how I've overcome it. If I get up and tell everybody about this, others in the audience, first of all, will realize they're not alone. They also may learn that there are interventions that they hadn't thought about that might be helpful to them. And they may get some questions answered about how can I more effectively deal with my spouse or loved one, or how can I get reunited with my children whom I'm very alienated from now because I've been such a miserable human being. So lots of things have happened, and lots of people get helped by hearing the stories of others. Now, AA is very clear that they are not a form of psychotherapy. But the reality is that the group dynamics that go on in AA really do provide psychological intervention and certainly some real healing. At the same time, I would have to tell you, AA does have its limitations. Some of its strongest adherents actually become quite anti-psychotherapy. And that becomes a problem for some people because there are individuals who are alcoholic. They've been dry for 8-9 years. I mean, they have simply given up drinking, and they're not going to drink anymore as far as they're concerned. But they realize that that's always a danger. But now that they haven't been drinking for 8 or 9 years, their marriage has changed. And the stereotype tends to be the male alcoholic, where the wife simply took care of him during his drunken episodes and during the time of his life where he was really alcoholic, and that meant the guy would come home almost night after night, be utterly intoxicated, might fall on the front steps and not even be able to get up the steps to get into the house, and the wife would go out and drag him in. Maybe the kids would too, and so that was what life was like with him. Well, now the person becomes dry, and the person becomes more effective at work, and the person comes home and is able to hug the kids and hug his wife and greet people. Well, this is quite a different person. And sometimes the anger over what happened years ago begins to come out in the family, especially with the wife. The guy didn't really even know. He was so intoxicated he never realized all the sacrifices the wife made. So now she's getting angry. And so she begins to find that she really doesn't want to be with him that much. Or if she's with him, she sure doesn't want to be intimate with him. So sexual kinds of problems develop. AA really is not prepared to deal with that level of intimacy. And when you get people in AA who discourage people from going into therapy, actually they're interfering with the growth of people. And one thing I certainly have observed with some of these people is that AA is wonderful to get you to stop drinking. It's a wonderful social support. It's been tremendously effective at keeping people from drinking. But when you progress to more mature issues like intimacy, AA doesn't have much to offer. It's tried to, in some ways, there are groups, like as I was saying, if you're in AA itself, that means you're alcoholic. But you can be in Al-Anon, which is the group for spouses of alcoholics. So there is a separate organization where you can go and share your pain with people about your alcoholic spouse, and people give each other, encouragement about how to deal with things. And there's Alateen, where groups of children of alcoholics can get together, and they can talk about what it's like to have dad or mom be drunk all the time, and what can they do. And of course, part of the dynamic here is you really want to help these kids and not feel guilty. That is, you don't want the kid to think, Dad is a drunk because I'm such a bad kid. So these interventions that have been developed by leaders in AA are really good, but they fall short when you get into more mature issues where the couple now is not dealing with dad being a drunk. Now they're dealing with dad as a real human being. Also, AA has had some difficulty in distinguishing between people who seem to have some physiological dependence on alcohol. That is, they start drinking, they may be fairly moderate drinkers, but once they start drinking, they just get smashed. And certainly there's research that shows us, or at least strongly suggests to us, that some people seem to have some kind of physiological predisposition to be alcoholic. There are other people who are alcoholic for very psychodynamic reasons. They really want to escape the pain of their world. They want to escape whatever problems they have, etc. And AA is less ready to deal with that. That is, as the person stops drinking, those issues are still there. The depression is still there, the worry is still there, perhaps the hostility is still there, and there really is a need for many people to seek other kinds of interventions. Now, also, this is a good, self-help groups are a good example of how ethnicity can play into things. If you're from, let's say, a Jewish family, you don't find a lot of Jewish people who are alcoholic. I mean, you're really going to stand out. If you're in a community that's mostly Jewish and you're drunk a lot, people are probably going to try to help you. And because people will realize that this is deviant in our population. We don't have a lot of people like this. On the other hand, if you live in an Irish community, being drunk is no big deal. I mean, it's part of, everybody has lots of relatives. Being part of that ethnic group, I can tell you that, amongst my relatives, I mean, there are all kinds of people who are alcoholic. Nobody thought much about it. That's going too far. It's not that nobody thought much about it, but people accepted it. Old so-and-so is a drunk, and old so-and-so is a drunk, and old so-and-so is a drunk. Well, there are a whole bunch of them, and we should try to help them, and eventually, these people often got to, often after they lost jobs, they ended up in hospitals, they dried out. And I was always amazed. People made great comebacks. I mean, they actually got over their drinking, which means they stopped drinking, and they led productive lives. But there was tremendous tolerance for it in the community. And so, on one hand, the tolerance in the community gains acceptance for the person, but it probably also delays them getting into something like AA or going for some kind of treatment, because everybody is so familiar with it, they just accept it. Now, the growth from this then has led to other kinds of self-help groups. And they deal, again, the idea is that you take a specific problem. There are groups for parents who have to deal with the death of a child. They're called compassionate friends. There are groups that deal with helping your own relatives cope with psychiatric problems, so that if you have a schizophrenic young person in the family, that can drain a tremendous amount of emotion from you, and there are groups been formed to give support to parents who are trying to deal with a schizophrenic child. There are groups so focused that they're solely for people who have survived incest. And having to disclose incest is obviously very difficult. But it's a lot easier if everybody in this room is somebody who experienced incest. And we might have similar feelings about what happened to us, similar rage, similar guilt, similar vulnerabilities. But you can talk about it and you realize you're not the only one here who was sexual with your dad or your mom, or your cousin or your uncle or whoever it was. That becomes very helpful to some people to realize that they are not alone. Then there are people who organize self-help groups around lifestyle issues. Parents without partners. Or the wonderful group, elderly group. Everybody know what the elderly group is called? The Gray Panthers. I think it's wonderful if you think back to the days of the Black Panthers, which were a very aggressive group. I mean, it was really going to make social change. And suddenly, you see the Gray Panthers. All us old types are going to go out there and we're going to change this culture so they pay attention to us old guys. But those are great groups. And they usually get started because the group feels underserved by society. And they feel that they're not going to flourish in society unless they get a whole bunch of them together. So there are organizations like AARP, for example, or ARP, I guess, the Association of Retired People. But I guess it's American Association of Retired, American Association of Retired People. But that's an organization. The Great Panthers are very different. The Great Panthers are more, they're organized to try to go after things that are very important for their age group. Now, another thing that has happened that we just don't know yet how this will work out, and there's essentially no research to help us. But you know, the internet has added to this whole self-help movement, because you don't even have to leave your house to go to a meeting. You can just go to a chat room, and you can get online, and you can be involved in all kinds of self-help experiences. And you know, it has, talk about anonymity. I mean, you really got you know, very significant anonymity, and people feel that anonymity. So we're at a point where the self-help movement is going forward, you know, very intensely, and we just don't know, you know, how many more ways there may be to help people who are in pain to improve. But if you recall my premise in the beginning, that one of the reasons why community psychology started was because, you know, psychologists were feeling we'll never train enough people to deal with all the problems that are out there. So you can see that all these alternative interventions are a way to not have to train professional people to deal with every problem that we face in society. The final thing I'll mention in this regard then are self-help books. Now, if you go into Hoarders, or you go into Crocs and Brentano's, or you go into any of these big bookstores, there are shelves and shelves of self-help books. I mean, all kinds of people have written about how to overcome almost any problem. Just the number of diet books is staggering. If you want to lose weight, you know, there are 700 ways that you can approach this problem. And we don't really have research on whether self-help books really make much difference. You know, kind of the speculation is that by themselves, people probably don't change much from reading a self-help book. But if they're in some kind of group, or they're in some kind of therapy, and they also read and get a chance to talk more honestly about, you know, strategies that they might use to improve their lives, the feeling is these things might be very helpful. And so one should not overlook these books as possible interventions. But the feeling is most difficult life problems are far too complicated to be solved by simply reading a book. I mean, if that worked, we would have figured out a long time ago that we'll just give you a book, and that will be sufficient. Now, I've been telling you about all these modes of intervention. What we're going to do now is we're going to talk about what has psychology learned scientifically about these modes of intervention. That is, when you really take a hard look at research on intervention, what do the studies tell you? And it's important to realize, of course, that, you know, psychologists are tremendously interested in this kind of research. Psychologists identify, clinical psychologists identify very much with the idea that not only are you a treatment person, but you are someone who thinks like a scientist. Now, that's despite the fact that if you look at the data, the average practicing clinical psychologist has never published a research paper. Not even one. Not even their dissertation. So, although the average person doesn't actually do the research, you'll find if you talk to psychologists that they're very identified with the fact that they are scientists, that they think along those lines, that they read the research, that they pay attention to research, that they're critics of research, both positively and negatively. And so the thing you want to be aware of is that that scientific training does influence the way they work with people, and it does influence the kinds of interventions they may try. Also, psychologists are interested in issues like validity and reliability that we talked about with interviewing and with testing. The same thing is true with intervention programs. And of course, they've been very interested, but we still don't know enough about really assessing primary prevention programs. And as I mentioned to you at an earlier time, you may recall, it's even very difficult to measure something if you've prevented it. It's not impossible, but it's more difficult. Now, there are a number of ways that psychologists conduct this kind of research. First of all, there are case studies. And if, could we have our, there we are. In this design, an individual person is examined in depth to determine if what that person experienced really made a difference. So the case study is one person. And this is a common research tool in clinical psychology because often it's just not possible to get a group of people who have the same problem and to examine whether or not the intervention you're going to use will make a difference. If you think back when post-traumatic stress disorders were first discovered, it goes, in many ways the sensitivity to that goes all the way back to the Second World War, but it especially became clear in Vietnam. And they began to treat people, just individuals, to see what will work. And one of the things that became really clear to people is that if you don't treat the disorder immediately, I mean, someone has a stress reaction, may be very serious, even to the point that where they're psychotic, hearing voices, seeing visions, etc. But if you treat them right up at the front, right, soon as this happens, often people overcame their difficulty and were able to go back and become productive members of the military. If you waited and you withdrew them significantly from the front and then you began to treat them, you found out it was going to take much longer. That if you don't intervene right away, as the people get more and more frightened, develop more and more symptoms, it takes a longer time. Those insights came from case studies, just came from being able to observe this person was able to go back, this person wasn't able. It wasn't like we assigned a whole bunch of people having post-traumatic stress disorders to being treated at the front versus being treated back in the States, etc. So we learn a lot of important information. Now, what happens in the design in this kind of study is each person is actually his or her own control. And what you do is you test the person right away. So let's say we have this very distressed individual. We give some tests to find out, how high is their stress? And so we establish a baseline. That is the amount of stress this person has right now. Then we do our intervention. And we work with the person. And let's say in some kind of psychotherapy, some kind of crisis intervention mode. And maybe we measure after a certain number of sessions and after a certain number of sessions. And then when we think the person has recovered sufficiently. And what you're measuring is you have this first measure, the person's stress level is way up here. And then after a few sessions, it's here. And after a few more sessions, it's here. And when they leave, it's here. And what this kind of design tells you, first of all, is, were you effective? That is, what was your target? Your target was to reduce stress. Did you reduce stress? Yes, you did. You can also see how much stress did you reduce after, let's say, 5 sessions? How much stress did you reduce after 15 sessions? How much stress after 20 sessions? And it may tell you, when you've probably reached maximum benefit. That is, maybe 15 sessions are about as much as someone needs. After 15 sessions, their stress level maybe doesn't go down very much. So the key that you would learn from the research is you want to take someone right away. You want to give them, let's say, a max of 15 sessions. And during that time, you should see a significant decrease in their stress level, let's say, after 5 sessions. So it's very important research. It obviously becomes very important if you're in a position where you can't give 15 sessions, knowing that 5 sessions can make a real difference in a person's life, allows you then to use that intervention. So we'll go on in our next section to talk about a lot of other designs that are used in researching intervention. But we'll take a break for now.